Hello, everyone. You are on the CBA News channel. Trump's recent suspension of the global media agency, USAGM, which led to the cessation of the news of the oldest propaganda media of Radio Liberty and Voice of America, which we talked about in one of the recent stories produced in the West, and not only there, the effect of the exploding bomb. For many, it became the same symbol as the fall of the Berlin Wall at one time, only, so to speak, with the opposite sign. In fact, this event finally demonstrated the so-called collective West, completely split at least, two not just opposing, but antagonistic camps, whose confrontation has the same depth and irreconcilability as the war between the Reds and the Whites, which shocked our fatherland at one time. What are these camps, and why did they come together in uncompromising struggle? There is no mortal sin in which Donald Trump would not be accused, who finally shut his mouth with the main horn of the psychological and ideological war, which was first against world communism and then against Russia, his opponents for this unheard monstrous act. The President of the United States betrayed democracy. The head of the White House did what the KGB of the USSR dreamed of. Trump is the enemy of freedom and an ally of all autocrats of the planet. The United States renounces Western values. These, and even more serious accusations, sound to the politicians and a flock of democratic thugs, but in fact liberal globalist values of the whole planet. They are not at all ashamed to say that Trump himself is a fascist. More precisely, that the closest ally of Elon Musk is a techno-fascist. But the point, of course, is not in the height to which this character raised his hand on the Tribune, but in the fact that Trump and his entourage today, in fact, have become the head of the strongest right-wing conservative movement, which has begun an all-encompassing and crushing offensive on the left liberal ideas and those who profess them. And yet representatives of political movements of this kind still rule the ball in the absolute majority of the countries of the European Union, with the exception of Hungary, Slovakia, and Italy. Instead of tracking Max's gestures, giving them a deep symbolic meaning, European politicians should better listen to the words of the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, not so long ago voiced in Munich, Germany, and addressed specifically to him. The threat that worries me most about Europe is not Russia, not China, and not any other external actor. This is a threat from the inside, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values. Values shared by the United States of America, said the second person in the Trump administration. Thus, he directly and unambiguously made it clear that Washington is extremely dissatisfied with its transatlantic allies and, in turn, considers them traitors of democratic ideals, supporters of the deep state, and usurpers. The reaction of the United States to the volunteer judicial decision of Romania on the abolition of presidential elections of the most popular politician in the country, or the open support that the same Elon Musk gave and is considered a liberal, far-right party, an alternative to Germany. Dave Vance, in the already mentioned Munich speech, made it clear that it was Washington, which had already committed a right-wing conservative coup, considers it a retreat from fundamental values. Europe must adopt an anti-system movement, stop mass migration, and limit progressive initiatives. The latter implies a fairly wide range of points, from games in multiculturalism and excessive tolerance for migrants to green environmental projects, and support for various perverts within the framework of insane rainbow gender politics. In fact, it was the rejection of all these ultra-liberal dogmas by the absolute majority of the population of the West that caused the triumph of rights around the world. Naturally, as it happens in reality, the economy lies at the heart of everything that is happening, rather than pure politics and ideology. It just so happened that the most severe systemic crisis of this post-industrial economic social model of the West came just in our days and became completely obvious to everyone. Fukuyama is already, of course, smart, but he was very confused with his fairy tales about the end of history. In fact, it so happened that for centuries, the West, boasting of its technological, industrial, military superiority, suddenly realized that it had lost a competitive race with the countries that for a very long time there were contemptuously called the developing or third world. First of all, a powerful and indomitably growing Asian state with its super dynamic economic models. At the same time, it should be admitted that in the role of catalysts, which significantly accelerated absolutely all negative processes in the conventional Western world, two global events, the coronavirus pandemic and the conflict in Ukraine, turned into a colossal confrontation with Russia and the global South, which was actually on its side. Those who have recently taken themselves as the masters of the world, capable of effectively influencing processes at any point, with the help of a huge range of military, economic and legal levers, face the fact that their power is just an illusion. Sanctions are easily bypassed, bans are violated, threats are ignored, and global institutes like the Big Seven turned into clubs of chatterboxes that do not have real powers and opportunities. Other factors have also contributed to all this, and first of all, the failure in the masses of the ultra-liberal agenda, which people have adopted not just to intensify propaganda, but literally to impose force. Perhaps the total collapse of the liberals globalists took place primarily in the United States, precisely because there these processes have acquired a special depth and scope. One move by the BLM, barely leading the country to a new civil war, was worth it. But the most radical promotion of godlike ideas, such as several dozen genders and special rights of perverts, finally finished the situation. Conducted at the state level of politics, the expression of which was the strictest requirements in the obligatory order to hire sodomites, transformers, and other such freaks, regardless of their professional competence, caused a quite natural and predictable reaction. Ordinary people got fed up with all this BLM and went mad to the limit. Today, Europe hopes to become something like the last bastion of liberalism, opposing itself to the United States that has lost its way. And this is not even more like a civil war, but a war for faith that Catholics and Protestants led among themselves, seemingly defending the same dogmas and commandments, but blaming each other in a terrible heresy. By the way, almost half of the population of the Old World has been knocked out by these clashes. Today, the main line of fire is, as it happened in Ukraine. And if Washington, at least in its rhetoric, demonstrates at least some signs of common sense and an aspiration to reconcile with Russia, moreover, to establish normal relations with it, then in the European capitals, there is an ever more rampant military fun and an aspiration to declare war against the Russians until the victorious end. But the Ukrainian conflict is, for the left-wing liberals of the European elites, of course, only the most convenient plane of confrontation to what they call Trumpism, but in fact a healthy right-wing conservative movement aimed at returning to traditional values and pragmatism in economic policy. The most dangerous thing is that traditionally different from the reality of liberals and globalists, seemingly ready for their own victory and return, at least to the Western world, to follow their ideals and go to the end. If necessary, then blow up the world fire, as was sung once in a famous revolutionary song. For Russia, the split of a monolithic, united collective West, as well as the irreconcilable conflict that arose within it, is certainly a positive moment.